Well, hello and welcome to today's brief introductory lesson where we're going to be talking about the birth of experimental chemistry, as well as kind of an overview of chemistry today, as well as some ways that you can get the most out of this course. So before we do that, though, I think it's really important that we try to understand how a chemist like myself views the world, because I think that'll help us as we dive into the concepts covered in this class to think like a chemist. So a chemist views the world differently than a biologist or a geologist, in that primarily a chemist thinks of the stuff that makes up the universe in terms of molecules. Okay, so a chemist thinks of molecules. So whereas a biologist would think of an organism or a cell, a chemist is more interested in the molecules that make up that organism or that cell. So here's a few examples. This is a chemist's view of hydrogen here on the left, DNA here in the center, and a protein here on the right. So each one of these examples is showing the molecular structure of these things. And if they seem complicated now, don't worry about it. We're not really going to be covering proteins or DNA in this course. But I just want you to get the idea of how a chemist thinks, that these things, like a protein, are comprised of elements that bind together to form these bigger subunits, or in other words, molecules. Okay, so these elements are coming together to form like a DNA molecule. So that's how we're going to think. We're going to think in things in terms of molecules or substances that are coming together. And the question then becomes, how did we get here? Okay, how did the thinking throughout history get to this point? And I like the history of science, so I think that's a pretty interesting question to try to understand. And really, the beginning of experimental chemistry started with this guy, Antoine Lavoisier. And if anybody is French, I'm probably pronouncing his name really poorly, but that's my best job at it. But this guy named Lavoisier was a researcher in the late 1700s, and he was trying to answer this question. When you burn a wooden log, right, all that remains is a small amount of ash. What happened to the rest of the log? Where did it go? You know, and what process is involved in burning? Okay. And there was a few different ways that people would try to answer this question throughout history. And the reigning theory in his day was that all flammable materials are made up of two things: a mysterious substance called phlogiston, and what remains after burning. In other words, that these materials are made up of phlogiston and ash. Okay, so that's weird. There's this mysterious thing called phlogiston that leaves the log when it burns and leaves behind the ash. And so a log is comprised of these two things, or anything that burns, I should say, is made up of these two things. So Lavoisier was skeptical of this theory, and so he thought that he had a way to test it. And so what he did, he put some phosphorus in a jar, and he burnt the phosphorus. And this jar had a balloon on the top filled with air. Okay, so Lavoisier is going to burn the phosphorus and see what happens. And he observed two things. One, the ash at the bottom of the jar was heavier after burning than the original phosphorus. Okay, so that's interesting, because if there's this mysterious substance in all flammable things called phlogiston, then the ash should weigh less, right? So that's strike one against phlogiston. Strike two is that it looks like there's something going on with the air. There's less air after burning than before, okay? So the balloon shrunk. What's going on here? You know, what's happening? So, like any good scientist, Lavoisier did another experiment. So this time it's with mercury and oxygen. And what he did, he placed some mercury in a container, sealed container, and heated it up with a furnace. And that mercury burned in the air trapped in this jar. Okay? And it formed this red solid. You can't really see maybe in the picture, but there's this red solid that formed in the jar. And what he found was that the red solid, the weight of this red solid, weighed more than the weight of the original mercury, similar to the phosphorus experiment. And also the air inside the jar, the amount of air decreased, similar to the balloon. So that really did away with the phlogiston theory here, that everything that burns is giving off these mysterious phlogiston particles, I guess. And a new hypothesis took place. When a substance burns, it combines with oxygen in the air. And so that's something we're going to be talking about when we get to combustion reactions later in the semester. But for now, that's the result from Lavoisier's experiment, that there isn't a such thing, or there isn't something called phlogiston. And what Lavoisier did was really a great example of the scientific method. So we've probably seen this quite a lot in high school, maybe even middle school, where the scientific method involves an observation, okay? Then we're going to have a hypothesis, okay? And, a theory, a law, and skepticism and testing. So, and these kind of all build on each other. So let's examine it then, how Lavoisier used the scientific method. So he started out with observation, and that was that when you burn a wooden log, it loses weight when it burns. So then the theory was, or the hypothesis, was that all things that burn, okay, are comprised of phlogiston and ash. Okay, so that was the hypothesis at the time. So he was skeptical, okay, he did not believe that that was the case. So he made 2 experiments that would test that hypothesis, that when I burn mercury and when I burn phosphorus, the ash that remains, or what remains, should weigh less than the original thing that I burned. So that was his predicted outcome. He tested that hypothesis in the laboratory, as we saw, and what he found was, well, actually, no, they weigh more, and there's less air in the jar afterwards. So let's come up with a new theory, and that theory was, now when things burn, they react with oxygen in the air. Okay? And so he tested again, he revised his hypothesis, and that's really how a theory is made. We go from a hypothesis to a theory with more experiments. So again, that was kind of the birth of experimental chemistry, and using the scientific method to make discoveries. Now, we go from there in the 1700s to today, and chemistry has grown a lot. So, and I would argue that chemistry has a really unique position in science, in that it intersects with many different areas like biology, physics, applied sciences, earth and space sciences. These are all areas that chemistry overlaps with. So there's 5 traditional subdivisions of chemistry. There's analytical chemistry, biochemistry, organic chemistry, inorganic chemistry, and my favorite, because this is what I am, physical chemistry. So my research really is at this intersection between physics and chemistry. So I'm a physical chemist. So that's my subdivision, and that just shows you, though, the broad scope of chemistry, that it's not just like what we would think about with Lavoisier. It really touches on a lot of different aspects and things that we use every day in our life. So, for example, chemistry plays a role in designing touch screens, the material used in your touch screen of your cell phone. Certainly a chemist and a material scientist, I would say, had to think about that and what went into the material that is required to make that device. Of course, chemists synthesize drugs like Tylenol and other things to help us. And also diabetes test strips, that also has chemistry involved in it if you look at it, because it has to give you a reading of the glucose in someone's blood. And that, I think, would touch more on analytical chemistry, actually. So all of these and so many more are examples of chemistry today. So we go from Levisuet's day, using the scientific method, and now here we can use chemistry to do all sorts of things that I'm sure Levisuet never even thought of. So how do we learn chemistry then? So for many of you, this is your first class taking chemistry. And actually, this was my first class too. When I came to college, I didn't take chemistry in high school. And this introductory chemistry class was the first class I took. And it really started me off on this journey of loving chemistry. So here's what we need to do. You need to be able to commit quality time while studying. So what do I mean by that? Well, obviously this class is online. So it's very easy to have distractions going on in the background when you're trying to study the material for this class. So it's probably not best for you to have a movie going on in the background when you're watching these videos or when you're studying for an exam. Okay, so really give yourself that dedicated time and dedicated space where you could study the material covered in this course effectively. So that's one thing. Second thing is to commit to utilizing all learning resources available to you, like these lecture videos. I'm not going to know if you watch these lecture videos or not, okay? I hope you do. I've spent time putting them together and recording them for you, so I hope you take the time to listen to them, but I'm not going to know if you do. So that's on you. So make sure you spend the time watching these videos, and if you're struggling, find help. So there's the tutoring center, all of these things that you could find help with. So commit to improving as well. So what I mean by that is that you, like I said, may be taking your first chemistry class. So you're not used to thinking like a chemist yet, and that's fine. That's something that we're going to learn as we go through the class is how do I think like a chemist? How do I solve these problems? So commit to improving the way you do problem solving and the way you approach problems. And that's something we're going to work on together throughout the semester. So that's not something you're going to have to do on your own. We're going to work at that together and try to help you to improve the way you think about these problems. So how do you think like a chemist then? We're going to be doing several different ways in this class where we're going to be thinking about things like particulates. We're going to be thinking symbolically. Here, this is, water going to gas. We're going to observe in the lab. And we're going to think of macroscopic things like a beaker filled with a chemical. So we're going to be thinking in all of these different ways. But that's okay. Because like I said, if you're new to thinking this way, remember that this is all about improvement. And that's something we're going to work on together. So until our next meeting, thanks for tuning in. And I look forward to our next video lecture together.